I think when a parent dies, there's a sort of process where most people, or a lot of people, go through a sort of reckoning as to what exactly was this parent's life about and how does it really sort of stack up. And my father was a very, very complex man and a rather difficult man as a father. And back in 2002, I felt I really needed to understand him better. And now that he was dead, in many ways, that was going to be easier to try and do that. At the same time, I think there was another question in my mind, which was, having grown up in North Yorkshire, lived there until I was 16, and then having lived in many, many different places, and in London for the last 25 years, there was a kind of question about, where do I really belong? I spent a lot of time, like I'm afraid a lot of people in London, wondering whether I should really be moving, and still having that kind of constant sort of pull towards the countryside. So this was a book, I think, also about my own sort of search for belonging and where did I feel at home, and why was it that whenever I went back to Yorkshire, there would be such profound ambivalence. On the one hand, I'd think, oh, I'm home. Once I got onto the moors, I'd think, right, I've finally got home. And then I'd always end up, like Isabel Allende, actually, just desperate to get away again. So it was trying to resolve those two questions that I think launched me on a book that has proved actually a much, much bigger journey in many, many ways than I could ever have envisaged. We live in times when relationship and identity are subjected to increasingly anxious interrogation. But we ignore an equally urgent need to know our place, to know where home is and where we belong. This casts questions about the nature of our relationships and identity, who we are, and who we belong to, adrift, without an anchoring in a place. The conservative philosopher Roger Scruton describes what my father believed, that belonging is a relationship in history, a relationship which binds both present and absent generations. But we need to be very careful about our understandings of home at a time when belonging has become one of the most fissile of political issues. If belonging is stripped down to a passport-like starkness as simply the place of your birth, then billions across the globe, the inhabitants of most streets in Britain, are consigned to a limbo of non-belonging. What I now understand is that my father's sense of place was a deliberate and in some ways quixotic choice. It was never an inheritance. Belonging became for him a lifelong project. And those relationships in history are not preordained, but there to be crafted and recrafted in each generation. We live on an island so crowded with ghosts that we've become adept at managing their stories, tidying some of them into visitor attractions and energetically forgetting the rest. We put ourselves into a timeless present with a past designed only to entertain and with little investment in the future. It makes our present very lonely. What happens to the stories of place that have sustained lives, identities, and relationships over generations? Can such stories cling to the fast-changing urban environment, where buildings are knocked down and rise up again in cycles outside our knowledge or control? Where will these mobile urban populations call home? And will they experience its loss as liberation or disorientation, or neither, finding new paths to their own plots? During the 1930s, suburban London was expanding faster than at any other time before or after. The population of London, it was its all-time high in 1939. And my father was right on that front line. Those suburbs of Barnet were being built as he was growing up. So what he saw was a kind of rural landscape of southern Hertfordshire being gobbled up by rows of little new suburban streets. And he fled, and he never went back to Barnet. He absolutely hated Barnet, and he was partly sort of evacuated in the Second World War. In 1942, he was sent north to school to escape the bombs of London, and he fell in love with the landscape of North Yorkshire for many reasons. One is that I think he felt that this was the refuge from a sort of industrial civilization of mass consumer culture, which absolutely abhorred him in a sort of William Morris style. critique. But I think also he very quickly decided that contrary to the aspirations of his very bourgeois and very ambitious parents, that he was going to be a carver, and that it was working with his hands which most interested him, and he became a sculptor, and that his whole life in North Yorkshire was about sculpting York stone. And the landscape of North Yorkshire, with its tradition of hand working, is what I think he decided he wanted to live amongst. And the interesting thing is there's a very strong link between Yorkshire and the visual arts. I mean, you think of Henry Moore and Barbara Hepworth and Andy Goldsworthy. And I think Goldsworthy in particular was very interesting. He said the two sort of jobs which require intervention in the landscape are farming and the artist. So it was very appropriate that my father lived in farming communities for 60 plus years of his life. Well, this is something I had never realised until I went back through his papers after he died. And it was much, much more significant than I imagined. He was on a schoolboy ramble in 1944. He was 16, a few months off his 17th birthday. And I was walking across the hillsides, and he comes to these very dishevelled sort of ruins of a farmhouse that had been abandoned for over 60 years. And the day was actually D-Day. And I imagine that for a 16-year-old boy on D-Day, it must have been a very, very sort of intimidating moment when you knew that many of your generation, just a few years older than you, were crossing the Channel in those horrible boats, getting soaked in the spray, and knowing that you would be fighting alongside them in a matter of no more than a year or so. And I think it was the intersection of the sort of time and place on that day in June 1944, which meant that 12 years later, he came back and leased the land. He was a penniless sculptor at the time, so it was not like a rich man's whim. But he had not expected to live his life. And he felt such a sense of debt towards those that had ended up dying that he built this war memorial chapel on this acre on the edge of the North York Moors. There's a whole number of carvings on the walls. There are plaques to 3 contemporaries who did die in the war, all of which had great artistic ambitions, which sadly were never fulfilled. And I think he identified with these 3. One was a poet, one was a classicist, and one was a writer and diarist. And I think he felt that, that they'd not had that opportunity to sort of pursue that artistic fulfillment that he had. And the most poignant thing, which even as a child I remember being so sort of struck by, is that the chapel is extremely simply built, and it's quite small. But across the floor of the chapel, really from the door pretty much to the altar, is the effigy of the soldier. And it's carved very naturalistically with the kind of treads of the boot and the checked shirt and the belt of his trousers and the pockets and so forth. And it was Anthony Gormley, who was one of my father's pupils, because my father was a part-time art teacher as well, who reminded me of something that my father would definitely have known, which is that Michelangelo in his La Pieta, it's actually the corpse of La Pieta is Michelangelo's body. He used his own body in the sculpture. And Gormley provoked the question in my mind, is that whether that soldier lying the full length of the chapel is actually, in some way, unconsciously even perhaps, my father's corpse, the corpse he thought, he might well have, been. It's very much his proportions, short and very stocky. In the course of the research of the book, I obviously talked to all the farmers and the forestry workers and all kinds of people that have either moved to the area or walk in the area, or the tourists, to explore their sense of belonging. And one particular family were immensely helpful, a farmer whose family had lived in the area for several generations, who had known my father. And I felt in a way it was a kind of contrast to present these two stories, because there was this farmer who could really talk about the way in which he felt a sense of belonging. And it's a very sharp contrast with my own father's sense of belonging, which was a sort of persistent, what's the word? He wanted to be adopted, and I reckon it took him about 25 years but he stuck at it, and by the last part of his life, the Yorkshire communities did reckon he was one of them, but it took a very long time. Whereas the farming family are obviously have a much more traditional concept of belonging. And when we were filming for a little film The Guardian are going to put on the website last week, in the interview with the farmer, I said, would you ever move or live anywhere else? And he said, why would I do that? I come from around here. And that was really, as far as he was concerned, that was the only answer he needed to give. And that is our traditional notion of belonging. So I thought it was very good to sort of offer those kind of contrasts, really. In the 1890s, the smallholding was abandoned because there's no accessible running water. You have to go basically down the hill to get the running water. And this was a period of time on the North Yorkshire moors when all of the more remote farms were being abandoned. And actually, that period lasted, a slow process of retrenchment, pulling off the moors on all those least viable farms. And that continued for about 70 years. So I recount a memory I had as a child of sort of stumbling into an abandoned farmhouse in a very remote part of the moors and discovering everything almost still there. It was a sort of Marie Celeste experience. All the cupboards were still full of belongings. Now that all changed in the 70s because the weekenders arrived. And they moved back into the abandoned farmhouses and did them up. So in a funny way, my father was sort of 20 years ahead in the fact that he reclaimed one of these small holdings. Obviously turned it for very different purposes. But one of the things the book is charting, I think, is the decline of farming in areas where it's always been pretty marginal. It's always been a struggle to farm in these areas. They're very picturesque, but actually totally uneconomic in terms of modern farming. So they get propped up by subsidy, and now most of the farmers have to diversify. Either they've stopped the farming altogether, or they do bread and breakfast. In fact, the farming becomes necessary to attract the bed and breakfasts. So you say working farm in your bed and breakfast advert, and that pulls the punters in, but actually working is, really pretty negligible. One of the things that I wanted to do in the book was really trace how an acre of land had been used over 12,000 years. So could I thread my own father's story and my experience of the acre through a continuum? So that, and what I was trying to do really is to kind of challenge how we normally tell the stories about place. So turf out the chronology, do a sort of thematic structure, and try and sort of, in a way, be more faithful to how we experience place. Because if you have a strong sense of place somewhere, there's a jumble of personal associations, bits of history you may have heard, other people's experiences. And it seems to me that if I could do that kind of, represent that in the book, then that was opening up how we really experience place. Living in Hackney, I've spent a lot of time thinking about what is it that I've learnt from the research for this book and from sitting on this acre for a long time that I can bring back home. There are several responses. One, the postcode gangs is a really, really vivid. My son travels on public transport, age 12. The first question that a gang of kids approached him with the other day is, "What postcode are you?" And so, when people say to me, as they have done recently, place is out of date, it doesn't really matter, I don't mind where I am, I live wherever. I really think actually that may be true of them, but it's not true of lots of other people. So place is very important. Now, you say, what is there in the urban environment of the natural environment? Well, I think it takes a bit of digging, but it's certainly there in Hackney. What I find fascinating is the River Lee, which is choked with rubbish and dreadfully, the banks of it are dreadfully kind of full of rubbish and all the rest of it. But, in a walk I had along the River Lee in July, it was fascinating, the encounters I had all the way along with people who had formed their own understanding of the River Lee. There was one guy who was certainly, ethnic minority, I don't know, Asian maybe, but he was there, standing there, looking at the fish in the river. There were some very spectacular fish. And he said, just think, they may have been coming up this river for 12,000 or more years. So, you know, I really think it is perfectly possible. It only requires our imaginations to create senses of place, which can absolutely absorb newcomers with their stories. And I thought, as I listened to him talking about the fish, and, you know, minutes later, I was talking to a guy who'd grown up in the area, been there during the bombing of the Second World War, and he was talking about his kids and how they spent so much time in front of the telly and why couldn't he bring them down to the Rivoli. These are stories that people can share, and if we have enough imagination and enough generosity of spirit, we can develop narratives of place that are not exclusive. I think you have a great challenge, really. I mean, creating a new place is, I think, a kind of huge responsibility, really. When in the sort of exploring of the kind of urban environment that I live in, I took the kids on a cycle ride up to Waltham Abbey from Hackney along the canals, which they complained bitterly about because we went past a lot of rubbish dumps and warehouses. But I found absolutely fascinating. But I have to say that one of the most kind of chilling places that we passed on that route was a set of housing estates that have been built sort of under the pylons that bring the electricity into London. And the buildings are quite handsome. You know, they've been carefully designed. There's lots of play areas, parkland. But, you know, it was a sort of, there was such a sense of anonymity. And, you know, you just kind of wondered, there was a sort of migrant, an ethnic minority family, and you wondered how on earth do they create a sense of place. And I suppose what I would argue for is that any such building development project invests properly in the kind of community development work that's needed to help craft those senses of place. And that involves artists working with a community, you know, which does happen, I know, and you'll know about that too. But it also involves, I think, a kind of political activism as well. And that kind of community development work is just vital. Otherwise, one creates these dreadful hollow communities which people abandon, and they don't work, and it's a dreadful waste of the investment that's been made in trying to build these homes. So, how do you build community? You know, it's involving schools and any other community institutions. I mean, it's fascinating work, but it's not easy, and it needs proper investment.